since we kind of started talking about the earth and rocks and stuff, I do want to spend some time, and I give you a reading assignment out of another textbook, also written by Dr. Weil. There's some key information here that I want to get to you. Okay, and so that's why I've added it in here. We're going to talk about archaeology, geology, and paleontology. Okay, let's define some terms. So archaeology is studying past human life as revealed by preserved relics. So the stuff we dig up, that's what archaeology is. Then there's geology. Well, guess what? That's the rocks themselves. Then there's paleontology, which is kind of the bigger, broader study of life's history, not just mankind, but life's history. So think fossils. Now, geology and paleontology go together because we find the fossils in the rocks. And several of you have kids. I know I have kids. I was a kid. Things like dinosaurs and fossils are just for some reason, capture our interest. And we can learn a lot from them. However, there's a lot of misused and ill-used information in these fields of science. So back to 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test everything, retain what is good. All right, let's get back to archaeology. This is the study of past human life. So the main strength of archaeology is this. We get to clarify the history of civilizations, especially for the ones that we have historical records. And historical records fall in that category called relics. Okay? We have books. The question is, how do we know that the historical facts that we're reading are actually true?
Well, there's corroborating evidence.
And that's where, exactly, and that's why I want to take you through these three tests. There's three tests, and this is independent of the historical book you're looking at. This is not, you use this test for the Bible, and you use this test for Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, or, some other text. These are the three tests that are used regardless of what the historical book is. There's an internal test, an external test, and a bibliographic test. And Joe, the one you wrote, the comment you made is really tied up in the external test, and you'll see here in a minute. So the internal test. This is internal to the document itself. It cannot contradict itself. It must be internally, hence the name internal test, internally consistent. It can't in one chapter say the sky is blue and in the next chapter say the sky is green. That would not be consistent. Right? The challenge though, and since you guys, I'm pretty sure you've already taken your class in biblical interpretation, i.e. hermeneutics. Guess what? We have to deal with this thing called language. And language changes over time. And because language changes over time, we might think there's contradictions when there aren't. Here's a big example. The Greek that they speak today in Greece is different from the ancient Greek that the New Testament is written in. You probably already know that that Greek that the Bible is written in is called Koine Greek, Koine Greek. That's different than the Greek that they speak in Greece today. There's similarities, but there are differences. Similarly, the English that we speak today is different from Old and Middle English. And the English we speak in America is different from the English they speak in England. Maybe some of you had to take a class in high school or college somewhere, and you had to study this thing called the Canterbury Tales. Well, the Canterbury Tales were written by Geoffrey Chaucer in 1392. And these lines here are straight out of the text. And I'm going to let Dr. Weil read them to you because I would slaughter it.
One fell opera with its sure resulta, dropped of March hath pierced to the rota, bath in every vein its which liqueur, of which thereto enchanted.
Do that again.
One fell opera with its sure resulta, the dropped of March hath pierced to the rota, and bath in every vein its which liqueur, of which thereto enchanted is the floor.
Yes, that's English.
Yeah, no, that's not.
It's some form of Elvish. I can't understand it.
Was he quoting from The Lord of the Rings?
It's like an inebriated Scottish man. Like it sounds very familiar in song, but in content it's just something else.
Yeah. I mean, some of the words like that, April, with, right, the, and, every, but the rest of it is like, whoa.
I actually had to memorize this in high school, and I did not pronounce it anything like he just did.
All righty. So you're starting to get my point about language, and that's my objective. Well, how about this one? Even our current language. How about this word, L-E-A-D? Well, when we pronounce it with a long E sound like lead, well, guess what? As a verb, it means to direct. As a noun, it means a position in front. As an adjective, it means to act or serve as the lead. But when you pronounce it as lead, right, there's kind of the short E sound. Guess what? It's a soft gray metal. Oh, and then there's the homonym L-E-D. That's the past tense of the verb lead. So imagine the challenges of translating from one language to another. Here's James 1:21 in the Greek. And I've given you the actual Greek and the transliterated English letters. Dio apothemenoi, pasin riparian kai perisian, kakaias en prautiti, texaphthe, ton emphyton logon ton dynamenon, sosai tas psychus hymen. Yeah, I slaughtered the Greek, but here it is in King James English as of AD 1611. Wherefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. Fast forward 385 years. We have the New Living Translation. And it says, so get rid of all the filth and evil in your lives, and humbly accept the word of God has planted in your hearts, for it has the power to save your souls. the language has a tendency to change over time. So I need to introduce you to this thing called Aristotle's dictum. It says the benefit of the doubt is to be given to the document itself, not to be assigned by the interpreter or critic. What that means is if you have two passages that seem to contradict each other, they are not to be counted as a contradiction if a legitimate explanation can be offered. And again, remember, these are tests, these are rules that are used with ancient literature independent of whether it's sacred text or secular text. All righty. That's the internal test. The external test. Does the document contradict other known historical facts? Right? There's two ways to apply this test. First, compare that document, the new one, to ones that have already passed the three tests. Then there's also the high five, obvious, compare it to known archaeological facts. Right? Here's an example. In Acts 17:16 through 34, this is where Paul is doing the Sermon on Mars Hill. Okay? He talks about being in Athens. He talks about the Areopagus. He talks about the various temples. Okay? And I'm assuming you guys are familiar with that passage, right? So we could take this passage and then look at known archaeological facts. And Dr. Weil does a great job here, so I'm going to let him chat.
The Acropolis is a hill in Athens that holds several ancient temples, including the Parthenon, which is the building on the right. This impressive structure was a temple to Athena, a pagan goddess who the people of Athens thought would protect their city. Like the other buildings at the Acropolis, the Parthenon is undergoing restoration in an attempt to preserve what's left. That's why you see scaffolding and the like all around the Parthenon. Now, in ancient times, the Acropolis was the center of religious activity in Athens, but just down the hill was the Areopagus, which was the center of argumentation in ancient Athens. For example, if someone was accused of murder, his trial would be held on the Areopagus. Also, philosophers would come to the Areopagus to debate. The fact that the Bible puts Paul at the Areopagus while he is arguing about Christianity with the Athenians is another piece of evidence to indicate the validity of the account because it puts Paul at the proper place for such debate. The view from the top of the Areopagus is quite impressive, and you can see why it was used as a center for debate. If you look up the hill, you will see the Acropolis. This was supposed to remind the people on trial and the philosophers debating that the gods were supposedly watching them.
Okay. Next, the bibliographic test. And this is considered the most important of these three, internal, external, bibliographic. Okay? Here's the foundation. To be a reliable document, the work must contain either direct eyewitness accounts or a secondhand report that's based on eyewitness accounts. Which kind of presents a challenge because we have almost none of the original documents.
No, but we have enough of the corroborating documents that have been written that were supposedly copied from older documents, maybe even the originals, that were in close enough approximation to each other in the wording, the verbiage, the language, even the jots and tittles, that we can surmise from those documents that there are thousands in existence of, that they were probably closely copied from original sources that said almost the same exact thing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna walk you through that here. You're spot on, Joe. You got it. And I'm gonna articulate that very specifically as we move on. All right. Two. The question is, how do we know the words on the copy are truly the words from the original? Well, the bibliographic test asks two questions. One, and you hinted, you touched on this. How many years passed between the original work and the time of the first copy we have? And so the shorter the time span, the more reliable the document is. So, time between the original work and the first copy. That's one test, one question. The second question is, how many different copies made by different people? So you have numbers of copies, but you also have the number of copiers exist. So if you have lots of copies made by lots of different people, and they all basically say the same thing, it's very unlikely the original was modified. Which again, you touched on, Joe. All right. You may run across a term called supporting documents. Typically that means that's referring to the copies. All righty. There's this old dead Greek guy named Sophocles who said one must learn a thing by doing it, for though you think you know, you have no certainty until you try. So let's go take each of these three tests and apply it to the Bible. Let's start with the internal test. Well, remember the internal test, it can't contradict itself. All right. How many of you have been told by somebody with a straight face the Bible is full of contradictions? All right. Well, guess what? Even as far back as 1860, there's guys publishing books that, like this title, Self-Contradictions of the Bible. And he claims that it contradicts itself at least 144 times. Here's one. Matthew chapter 1, verse 16 says, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And then in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, it says, Jesus, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. Wait a minute. Is this a contradiction? It's not. Okay? Understanding the place that women held in society and the way it was written at the time. Okay? Eli was Mary's dad. Jacob was Joseph's dad. And it's actually not a contradiction. It's actually additional information. And contrary to what some might claim, if you actually take time to look at the Bible in it, the whole thing, you're not going to find any passages that contradict one another. So what that means is, guess what? The Bible passes the internal test. And in fact, the Bible has fewer difficulties from an internal test point of view than some of the other historical documents of the same time period. Highlighted, underlined, green, the Bible passes the internal test, as well as the histories of the Roman Empire that nobody disputes. Okay? Now let's go do the external test. Now remember, the external test, does the document contradict other known historical facts? Well, there are two ways we're going to run this. We're going to compare the document to other documents that have already passed the three tests. And then we're going to compare it to statements in the document to known archaeology. Well, this can be challenging because the Bible spans 1,600 years across 3 continents, 3 different languages, at least 40 different authors, 66 books. So it can be somewhat daunting task. What do? Well, there are a few objective authors. One is Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman, who wrote a book called Annals. There's Flavius Josephus, who was a Jew, who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews. Then there's another gentleman by the name of Thallus and another name by the name of Phlegon. All 4 of these books have passed all 3 tests. And the Bible is consistent with what those tell us. So that's the first part of the external test. Let's go look at archaeological facts. In Genesis chapter 14, it details a whole bunch of battles, right, that took place between a couple of ancient alliances. During one of the battles, guess what? Lot got captured. So Abram pulls together the Expendables and Expendables 2 and Expendables 3. No. Sorry. Pulls together a group of mercenaries. A group of his guys to go rescue Lot. Well, guess what? These tablets called the Mari tablets were discovered in 1933. And guess what? The kings mentioned in Genesis 14 are listed on those tablets. Here's a picture of the tablet. Here's another one. John 19:13 says Christ was tried before Pilate at a place called the Pavement. Now this guy, William F. Albright, world-renowned, highly respected archaeologist. In 1960, he demonstrated that the Pavement was actually the court of the Tower of Antonia, which was the headquarters of the Roman military. And the reason it had not been discovered before was that it had been buried during one of the times Jerusalem had been rebuilt. They just had to keep digging. Now, these are just a couple examples. There are many, 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 many more. Okay? The Bible truly stands out as an accurate source of history. We can say that the Bible passes the external test better than any other source of ancient history. Third test, the bibliographic text. Okay? This is the one that says to be a reliable document. It either contains direct eyewitnesses, the accounts from direct eyewitness, or the people that saw the eyewitnesses, the secondhand reports. Right? Remember we said we're going to ask 2 questions. How many years between the original and the first copy? Noting that the shorter the time span, the more reliable the document is. Second question, how many different copies made by different people exist for the document? So more copies by more people means more reliable. So let's go back and look at some of those other documents that I brought up when I mentioned the external test. Here's the Annals written by Cornelius Tacitus. There are 20 copies. The earliest copy that we know of was made 1,000 years after the original. Here's another one. It's called History by Pliny the Younger. 7 copies exist. The earliest one being copied 750 years after the original. Now, I quoted Sophocles for you. Sophocles was considered one of the greatest writers of ancient Greece, and he wrote a lot of stuff. One of his most famous works is known as Antigone. 193 copies that we have. The earliest known copy was written 1,400 years after the original. And Joe, I'm going to put numbers to the point you were making earlier. The New Testament, written by God, there are over 24,000 copies, the earliest of which were written 25 years after the original. Oh, and then as a kicker, then you have the Old Testament with the Dead Sea Scrolls found in 1947, right? The events of Isaiah happened around 450 BC. Well, guess what? There's a copy of the book of Isaiah written in 125 BC that was found. It was virtually identical to a copy from 895 AD. So in over 1,000 years, basically, the book of Isaiah was copied faithfully. Down to the jots and the tittles. So that means the Bible passes the bibliographic test better than any other ancient, work of history. So how do we know the Bible is true? Well, we got 3 tests. We got the bibliographic test. We got the internal test. We got the external test. With the bibliographic test, we can be sure the Bible we read today is faithful to the original eyewitness documents. With the internal test, we know the Bible passes the internal test just as well as any other ancient document. And from the external test, it passes it better than any other document of its time. So we don't need to rely on the Bible saying that the Bible is the Word of God, therefore it is the Word of God. We can move to an external, objective method, which is why I felt it was essential to spend time on this with you today. So you can come to the scientific conclusion that the stories and accounts in the Bible are more trustworthy than any of the other accounts we've looked about or read about the Roman Empire. Yeah. All righty, let's get back to archaeology. Right? Guess what? Those books, like the Bible, are relics. There are other relics. But it'd be good to know how old they are. So there's different ways of knowing how old things are. Most obvious is, like, if you've got a coin that has a date printed on it, that's a pretty good clue. That's what's called a known age. Right? Got a document that somebody wrote the date on, or you got a coin that has a date, embossed on it. Pretty good idea what the date is. That's called a known date.
I want one of those coins that says this particular emperor has successfully destroyed the Christian religion. That's the coin.
Like Diocletian. Diocletian was that guy. But he was wrong. Anyway, sorry. All it took was Constantine showing up, offering a big enough reward, and within 25 hours of that reward being posted, over 300 copies of the New Testament were presented to him. Yeah. This after a guy said, "I've wiped out the Bible, and with it all of Christianity." Silly boy. All right. There's this other age called an absolute age. It's actually a calculated age. George, to your point, we're going to get into dating methods at this point. Now, before we jump in there, there is one other. It's called the relative age. Basically, is this older or younger than something else? Okay, known age, ancient coins, right? Might be referenced in a work of history, right? Joe, as you pointed out, in your example, another is that, a work of history might mention the date the Egyptian king died, right? Archaeologist finds the king's tomb, and the artifacts buried can now be dated. Okay, good to go. An example, King Tut and his sarcophagus. Right? Picture on the right-hand side, we got a column from ancient Ephesus that has a date written on it. Trouble is, not many of these artifacts have dates on them. So we've got to be creative. So, before we move on, the only ages that are certain in archaeology are known ages. Everything else is an estimation, a guess, an assumption, something. Alrighty. Here's how we start addressing the rest of those relics. Let me introduce you to this thing called a tree. Anybody ever seen a slice of a tree with all the rings in it? Well, guess what? The study of tree rings is called dendrochronology. Trees get a fresh ring every year. Last year during the pandemic, my neighbor across the street decided they needed to have a swimming pool put in their backyard, and so they had to chop down some trees. And they had one of the trees they took out was about 2.5 feet in diameter. And so when they sliced off some chunks, I said, "May I have one of those, please?" He said, "Sure." So I brought it to my house. I counted up the rings. My estimate, based on what I could count, there were 45 rings in that tree. So that tree was 45 years old. Now, people have studied this stuff, and people have studied tree rings, and they've come up with this thing called, they've cataloged what are called master tree ring patterns, and it allows people to get back to dates as far as 6600 BC. Which means that ages, if you're using dendrochronology, that's an upper limit. That's as old as that thing can be. Now remember, the only ages that are certain in archaeology are the known ages. They had dates on them or tied to a known event where we know the date. All right, George, let's talk about radiometric and carbon-14 dating. Without getting into too much of the physics, okay? Basically, an assumption is made. Well, there is a known physical science thing that happens, especially with certain elements. They decay at a certain known and measurable rate. And so the assumption is made that at some point in the past there was a certain amount of that stuff And knowing how fast it decays, we can make an estimate of how old things are by how much is left in an item. Okay? For example, carbon-14. The gentleman that developed carbon-14 dating, okay, when he created this, assumed that there was a certain amount of carbon-14 available on Earth, which was then pulled up and became a part of almost all living things. Now, we know how fast carbon-14 decays into carbon-12. So his assumption is that if we can measure how much carbon-14 is in a object, we can kind of work the math backwards and estimate how old that item is. All right. On the slide, it says radiometric dating is usually unreliable with one exception, and that exception is the carbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating is as reliable as dendrochronology as long as the item being dated is less than 3,000 years old. And the reason that is because anything older than that, we don't have anything that has carbon-14 in it that we can measure the original amount. So radiometric dating, carbon-14 dating that says, oh yeah, it's millions and billions of years old is just an extrapolation. In fact, the guy who came up with carbon-14 dating, based on his assumptions, his method is at the very best only good up to estimating ages of 30,000 years old. So carbon dating has its place, less than 3,000 years old. But anything beyond that is pure speculation. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
Professor, sorry, the example one of my the biology teacher in our school uses is that you go into a room and the tap is running and a glass of a certain amount of liquid is filled to a certain amount, and if you calculate the rate in which the water is going into the glass and you back it up, you can guesstimate how long the tap has been running. But then we said, what happens if 5 minutes before you came in, he went shh and then locked it down? Like, it's like the carbon dating is limited. It's as far as we know, as far as we've measured, kind of thing, and that makes it inaccurate, right?
Yeah. Here's the example that I use in another class. Okay. If I light a candle and let it burn, right? And then you walk into the room and I ask you, okay, how long has that candle been burning? Do you have any idea?
I mean, I could figure a way to measure how long it takes for the candle to burn, and maybe like same thing, backtrack it in time, and I don't know.
But do you know how tall the candle was that I started with?
No, that's right. No idea.
You have no idea what the amount of stuff I started with. And beyond 3,000 years is purely a guess. Because we don't have any organic matter older than that gives us a number of carbon-14 to work with. So hopefully that helps. All right, one more age, an absolute age. I brought it up before. It's a calculated age. But it's calculated using a specific dating method. So if you're using, okay, something like dendrochronology, okay, we can get back a few thousand years. Okay, it's a calculated number. Okay, same thing with radiometric. You come up with a 64 million. Okay, it's a calculated number. So please, absolute does not mean correct or sure. It just means it's an assigned value. Okay? Words have meaning. So I want you to understand known age, relative age, absolute age. Those words have very specific meanings. So if you're talking with somebody and they're playing loosey-goosey with their terminology, nail them down. Get them to define their terms. Okay? The terms that I've given you here are the accepted definitions and the way archaeologists use them. So let me encourage you to be skeptical, because you can go into museums all over the world and they will give you dates of hundreds of thousands or even millions of years on things. Okay? Dendrochronology is our most reliable dating method, and it can only give us ages of about 8,000 years-ish. I've already told you radiometric dating is highly suspect, with carbon-14 data being the exception, good up to about 3,000 years. And as I said, when we're talking about Mount St. Helens, they've used radiometric things like argon and krypton and potassium and different radiometric dating methods on rocks that are brand newly formed, and they're coming up with, you know, hundreds of thousands and millions of years old. And you're just like, really? You're going to trust this as a dating method? I'm back to 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test everything, retain what is good. Please. Oh, another verse comes to mind. Matthew, I can't think of the reference. 16. Be wise as serpents and harmless as doves.